Our water connection acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land throughout Australia and their connection to country, sky, water, and community. We extend our respect to the traditional custodians of the place where you are listening. This episode is recorded in Kaurna Country, and we acknowledge the mana whenua in New Zealand. What does water governance look like in Aotearoa New Zealand, and how is it changing? How is it different to Australia's water sector, and what can we learn from it? In this episode, we explore the water sector of a close and dear neighbour, Aotearoa New Zealand. My name is Jez Vorkes. I'm on a mission to create your water curiosity, and this is our Water Connection. Welcome to this new episode. For us to learn all about New Zealand's water sector, today I'm joined by Gillian Blythe. Gillian is the Chief Executive of Water New Zealand, the industry body promoting the sustainable management and development of the three waters: drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. She has worked as head of strategy and regulatory affairs for large listed companies and has participated in many sector advisory groups covering retail, wholesale, transmission, and climate action matters. Welcome to Water Connection, Gillian.
Thank you. A pleasure to be with you.
Thanks. Just to make sure that everyone's on the same page and maybe people are not that familiar with the New Zealand water sector, can you give us an overview on how this sector in Aotearoa New Zealand is structured?
So we have, at the moment, about 67 councils. And
Yes.
so they are local government authorities across the country, and they are responsible for the provision of drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. In Auckland is a little bit different because Watercare has been set up for a number of years as a council-controlled organisation, which is responsible for the provision of drinking water and wastewater. And in Wellington, there is also an organisation called Wellington Water, which provides drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater in this situation to a number of councils. But essentially, at the moment, water services are delivered by councils.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's already starting to differ a little bit to some of the stuff that happened in Australia. So that's very interesting. From the point of view of water sources, because I was thinking, well, here in Australia, in some parts, we don't have a lot of rain, and our water sources might be a river and like desalination plants and things like that. So I'm curious, what are the key sources of drinking water in New Zealand?
So depending on where we are in the country,
Yes.
you will have surface water and you will have groundwater accessing it from aquifers. We don't at this point have any desalination plants.
Cool. And then in this ecosystem of the water sector, what role does it play as Water New Zealand? I just was curious to know what's the role of Water New Zealand within the water sector over there?
So we're an industry association, and we were set up roughly 65 years ago, and we have grown over that time. And so today we've got about 3,300 individual members. Some are part of corporate members, and we are here. And for those people who are watching this as a video rather than as an audio only, behind me there is some words: ka ora te wai, ka ora te whenua, ka ora na tangata. And what it says in English is, if the water is healthy, the land is healthy, and the people are healthy. And so fundamentally, what we as an association are doing is trying to support the sustainable management of the water environment, with the particular focus on drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. And that saying, that whakatauki, is a mission, it's a vision. And so when we are trying to provide technical advice, whether that's on how you pressure pipe inspections, whether it's a calculation of emissions from wastewater treatment plants, whether it's about water loss management, whether it's about temporary traffic management, all of those bits and pieces which go into how a utility operates, we are trying to provide guidance and advice.
Yeah, okay. And would that be like using the knowledge of one particular water utility and share what this particular company learned with the rest of the world? Or you also have like your own kind of, I don't know, research or developments where you develop the knowledge and share around with your members?
It's a mixture of all of it. I mean, we've got a number of special interest groups. And so they've come together. You've got people who are members of Water New Zealand who've come together and said, I particularly want to engage on climate change, on modelling matters, on stormwater matters, on wastewater, backflow, smart water infrastructure. And so they come together and they want to create, they want to lift awareness, lift understanding, and to share knowledge. And sometimes that's through the creation of guidelines and manuals, or holding webinars, or holding conferences. At the same time, we, just as AWA does in Australia, they hold Ozwater. So we have our equivalent conferences in New Zealand where we are encouraging people to share their knowledge with the community through technical papers, through plenary keynote addresses, through panel conversations, and so forth.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I see a lot of similarities, of course, with the Australian Water Association as well, of gathering people with the same interest and maybe from different places to advance knowledge for the whole country. I'm curious, I saw, because I started following you on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, I see you quite active, in different parts of all of this reform that we're going to be talking to. But my impression is that Water New Zealand is a lot more active in that kind of shaping policy and being out there in the sessions where some of these things are discussed, which might be a little bit different to what the role of AWA is here. So I was curious to learn a little bit more about that kind of shaping policy and advocacy that Water New Zealand does.
Yep. So we've, for a long time, Water New Zealand has been highlighting the need for reform in the sector. People often go back to the year 2000 when we have a Parliamentary Commissioner of the Environment, which is an independent body. It's independent of Parliament. And the commissioner at the time wrote a paper called Murky Pipes and Aging Pipes and Murky Waters, I think was the right way around.
Yeah.
So there was a paper that was released, and ultimately in that paper, he talked about the fact that the governance structure for water in New Zealand was no longer fit for purpose. So those 67 councils that I talked about, he said that is not creating the focus on the water system that you need. Because as we know, councils deal with parks, they deal with rubbish, they deal with libraries, they have a multitude of things to do. And you actually need, in his recommendation, was to have organizations that are solely focusing on water. And the sooner that we got on to doing it, then we would be able to address the infrastructure deficit that we've got that has taken place and has grown over the decades. And so we as an association have been raising the issue of the need for some form of reform for a while. Then we had in 2016, Havelock North there was a contamination of the water supply, and a number of people got very sick, and the deaths of a number of people are attributed to contamination in the water. So that, you can imagine, when you have an incident like that, government takes an interest, and they started to think about the need to reform. And what do we have there was an inquiry and there were recommendations. And so what has happened since that time is that we have established a new regulator called Aotearoa, which is the Water Services Authority, and they are there to regulate drinking water. So it was removed from the Ministry of Health and put into a separate regulatory entity. That entity will also shine the light and provide oversight on wastewater and stormwater.
Okay. Yeah.
And so that was one step of the reforms. There are lots more steps, which
that's where I'm going exactly next. Because I've been reading that there have been a lot of significant reform in the recent years, and I can imagine now that we have painted the picture of how the original situation is. Yeah, can you walk us through the objectives of the reform and what is happening over there?
So there's been several, because as happens in Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere around the planet, occasionally the political masters change. There's an election. And so
I can't see how that would affect that.
And so our current government, which is a national-led government, they went into the election in 2023 with a policy that was to make adjustments and to repeal what the previous government had put in place. And their replacement was something called local water done well, which ultimately was to say we need councils to make decisions about how they're going to deliver their water services. And so there's been a number of pieces of legislation. So Water New Zealand has made submissions. I was at Select Committee last week talking about our latest submission on the local government water services bill. And ultimately, within that bill and the one that preceded it is a requirement for councils to make a decision. Do they want to continue to deliver water services in-house? If they deliver it in-house, they have to do it as a separate business unit. They have to ring fence the costs and the revenues associated with the provision of water. And so over time, you can imagine that sometimes what happens is that, other parts of the councils need to borrow a bit of money from the water situation.
Yes.
And so renewals have not always kept pace with the level that a good asset manager would like to see. And so part of this reform is to say, if you're going to be a business unit within council, we are going to ring fence that arrangement.
Yes.
So all money from that you and I pay as a water bill will go to the business unit. All expenditure needs to be shooted home to that business unit. That's option one. Option two is that you establish a council-controlled organisation, which is effectively a separate organisation with an independent board, and you would transfer into it the assets and the responsibilities for delivering water. There is a third option, which is, I suspect, a slightly peculiar to New Zealand option, which is called the Consumer Trust, which is, again, it's a separate entity. It's got a separate board, but it's under a trust arrangement as opposed to as a company.
Okay.
And there are some subtle differences in terms of access to finance or access to funding in practice. The local government funding agency, which currently goes out into the open market to provide funding for the councils, for the debt when they want to invest in something, that they will only lend to CCOs, so the council-controlled organisation.
Okay.
Or the council, but there is a ability for an independent council-controlled organisation to raise more debt through the local government funding agency than you could if they were within council.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So that's the differences that they will have to, each individual council needs to make that decision. That's interesting. Is there a timeline on that?
There is a timeline, and actually in practice, so each council needs to create a water service delivery plan by the 3rd of September this year. So 2025.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And ultimately that plan needs to demonstrate that they are financially sustainable. Now you can imagine that for some councils, they will not be able to demonstrate financial sustainability. And so they are thinking about whether to collaborate with neighbours, others within the region. And so you might see of those 67 councils, some coming together. You might see, 3, 4, 5 that are coming together because, you'll get some economies of scale. You'll only need one board, one management team. Hopefully over time, you've got everybody on the same asset management system, the same billing system, one call center, all of those sorts of pieces.
Yeah.
And so there are opportunities for cost efficiencies.
Yeah, I was going to ask that, like, if there was something in the plan of merging some of those, because 67 sounds quite high. So it's up to the same councils in this process of like thinking what they're going to do and thinking, demonstrating if they have the financial sustainability to start having those conversations with people around them, right?
Yep. And so they have to submit those plans to the government, to the Secretary of the Department of Internal Affairs, and that will demonstrate that they are financially viable and that they will achieve regulatory compliance by 2028. And those plans need to include an implementation plan. And so there is that arrangement, and we are expecting a number of new entities to be set up, probably 1 July 2026, and then maybe some in 1 July 2027, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's going to be quite a dynamic time in the next few years over there with all of those changes. So that's pretty interesting. I was curious to know what have been the main challenges of the structuring and implementing this kind of on the go, starting or like starting to happen. But what have been the main challenges of all of this water reform?
I think that one of the critical pieces, and it goes back to what was in place in the previous government, was that, as often is the case, local politicians want to ensure that they are able to represent the views of their communities. And so part of this whole conversation is around ensuring the local water, so the policy is called Local Water Done Well, is about how do we make sure that local water is able to be done well. And that goes to, these new entities will need to receive statement of shareholder expectations from their shareholding councils. And
Hmm.
and all of those sorts of pieces, and that's quite critical in terms of how we make this work.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And I actually had a question here as well on like how you making sure that the community is being listened in that sense. I mean, my feeling is that if it is the same as everyone else, people just open the taps, and having their water, and they don't think a little bit more where is that coming from. And it sounds like there's a lot of changes happening. How has been the experience of engaging the community in this process of like changing stuff, and what do people prefer, or like they really not like, what is the process there?
So one of the requirements for the councils before they submit these water service delivery plans is that they consult with their communities. I was looking at some consultation recently. I was in the South Island and I saw one of the districts, they were saying that they preferred the council controlled organisation version and they were wanting to seek feedback from the community. I was intrigued because that same council was saying, we are thinking that water meters might be a requirement as we go forward. And they were saying, we think water meters, they were supporting water meters, which was, again, it was an important component of that engaging with communities.
Yes, no, it's a very interesting time for sure. I had a question here, like how does the reform process considers Maori water rights? I know this is more on the urban side of things, but like I was curious to know how does that work there in terms of the Maori water rights and their own governance of the water, and how does that fit into this?
So I guess there have been a number of changes with this government's proposals relative to the previous government. So under the former government, we had co-governance. So iwi Māori would be represented on the governance boards.
Yep.
There were going to be some requirements for the water entities to give effect to something called Te Mana o Te Wai, which is ultimately about making sure we're looking after the health of water.
Yes.
And in a nutshell, this arrangement does not have iwi Māori on the boards as a matter of policy. That doesn't mean that individual councils may not, or choose to
Yes.
ask for local mana
To have it.
whenua to be
Yep.
on their boards.
Yes.
But there is nothing on it that says we need to have 50-50.
Yeah.
There are some changes at the moment in terms of the level of engagement. And so one of the pieces that Water New Zealand has submitted on in the legislative process is to say that we think there needs to be a requirement on these new entities to engage early and meaningfully with iwi Māori, which is something
Hmm.
the regulator has to do. And we think it's sort of like the symmetry. It's something that should happen, and B, it makes sense. If the regulator
Yes.
has to, then you should be thinking about it as well as a water utility. There will be a requirement for individual water service providers to ensure that they satisfy or comply with treaty settlements. So, for example, in the Waikato region, part of the important settlement for Waikato Tainui included the establishment of a water river authority. And so when whichever entity it ends up being, has an involvement in the Waikato River, they will need to make sure that they are
That's yeah.
working appropriately with the Waikato River Authority.
Yeah,
And
of
the
course.
same is true for other settlements. So the Whanganui River in the North Island was the first river in the world to receive legal personhood. And so again, the councils that are involved in the geographic region that includes the Whanganui River will need to make sure that they comply and meet those obligations.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it sounds like even though maybe was not in the policy as it is kind of from different angles consider, and then it's up to each council to probably consider that how formal they want to do that. So that's quite interesting. I was thinking about another question. It sounds like with all of this reform, like whether each council goes for option A, B, or C, they'll have to put a lot more effort, right, in like managing their infrastructure and managing their assets around water. Do you foresee that that will mean that you will need a lot of more professionals with experience in these particular areas compared to what is happening today, or the councils already have their own people? Will they need new people, and there is that people in the country to address that demand?
I think there's probably a number of things that is important to note. So
Yeah.
I Havelock North inquiry, so the result of the 2016 drinking water contamination event said we need to lift the capability and the capacity of the water sector. We know, and I suspect it's probably similar in parts of Australia, that occasionally, for example, in the rural regions, we might struggle to attract GPs. In the same way, we can struggle to attract people to work in certain regions, for multiple reasons. So there is definitely going to be a need to address the current vacancies, because we do have vacancies. There is a need to lift the capability of our workforce, because if you think about it, so for example, I'm sitting here in Wellington. At the moment, I don't have a water meter. And so there will be a need to introduce water meters, because we've been having conservation campaigns, and it is a sensible part, obviously, of addressing your water consumption and your future water needs to have
Yes.
meters as a demand management. So if you're thinking about the entity that is looking after the water supply in Wellington, they will need to have people who are thinking about meters. They will need to think about that engagement and that demand management with consumers. We know that as we look forward, that there are going to be emerging contaminants. You've got them you're experiencing in some parts of Australia issues with PFAS. We had
Yes.
some experience recently when there was discovered some arsenic in some of the water, which was, needed to be managed. That from time to time you might find Campylobacter or E. coli, all of these things,
Yes.
and that we need to be able to ensure that our people are ready to address the challenges that are thrown up by these things. There might be antimicrobial resistance. There's lots of things out there.
Yeah, and that's very interesting, because I think that my first thought on this is that the role that Water New Zealand is going to have in this process as well is super important and super key into being able to help people into getting more educated and upskilled in some of these things. Because as you were saying, like there will be new areas within the business once the things around the water meters are rolled out and many other of the changes happening. So definitely it's going to be a very dynamic sector. Before I move on into the other question, I was just curious, if you don't have a water meter, your water bill, is it a flat rate, or how does that work?
So at the moment, I pay for water through my rates bill. So it's a
Oh,
bill
okay.
that I get
It's bill.
charged by council, and it's
Yeah.
effectively on a rateable value of my property.
Of the property. Yeah.
And so that's going to be a change for some people throughout the country. I mean, over 50% do have meters, but there are, the other
The other 50. Yes.
doesn't. And so this will be a change, which I think is an important change.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's a good way to get into those water conservation efforts, because it will help people to actually know how much they're consuming and what is going on. Not only because they're going to pay it, but they might see it. They could see exactly how much they're like consuming and like compare it to other people and stuff like that. So yeah. Gillian, what do you think Australia could learn from this process that New Zealand is going through?
There are a couple of things. I think the engagement that we've had with our mana whenua has been a good one to be on the journey. I mean, I
Yes.
wouldn't like to suggest that we are A1 students by any stretch of the imagination, but I think the fact that we are engaging with our mana whenua and trying to understand the cultural significance of water to them is really important. And I think one of the pieces that we are trying to do is to understand Māori knowledge. So we talk about Māori mataranga. So mataranga is knowledge. And it's like, how can we take that knowledge and combine it with our technical knowledge about water sector practices? So, that can be everything from, you might be thinking about putting in, I'll give it in the context of a road rather than necessarily water, but, you might be thinking about, the most logical place to build a road from A to B is around a particular route. And then actually you start to realize that there is some local knowledge, local Māori knowledge, that area floods on a regular basis. And, there may be some stories about taniwha, which in practice is likely, and I hope that I am not being incorrect in how I am articulating this, because I'm not from New Zealand and I'm not Māori,
Yes.
is that taniwha is the water that is perhaps going across that land, which is rushing and raging, and therefore you want to be able to take on board that sort of knowledge when you're building your infrastructure. And there will be the same things, whether it's across the drinking water or wastewater or stormwater. And so I think being able to think about with the First Nations people within Australia of what is important. For Māori, it's abhorrent to discharge wastewater directly to water. There is a preference that it goes through land for a further cleaning to remove the tapu and to make it to make it clean. And that's something that I think is a really important piece for us to understand. And I know that every time I engage with mana whenua, I learn. And I think that's a really important piece.
Absolutely.
And by including mana whenua within our workforces, we are ensuring that we can do this on a day-to-day basis rather than just as a matter of a tick box exercise when one's trying to get a consent. I think it's really important to do early, meaningful engagement to bring in the mana whenua into our workforce, because we will end up with better outcomes by combining the two things.
Absolutely. I agree that would be something that I don't know much about New Zealand or the water sector, but the few things I know is like the very importance that you give to that interaction and the respect for the Maori knowledge and heritage and all that. So definitely that's something that we're trying to learn from here. We're trying to do. We're improving every time. There's a long way to go, but like we have all the willingness to really embed that in our society as well here now, in how we plan for our water systems.
Yeah, we're all on a journey.
This episode is proudly supported by the Chris Davies AM Fellowship, an initiative of the Australian Water Association. His legacy lives on through this fellowship, empowering efforts to keep his passion for innovation and community impact alive. We're honored to have the support of this fellowship this season too, as we continue to share stories that connect us all to water. Now, back to the episode. Gillian, how would you explain your work to a friend that knows nothing about this sector?
I think I would start by going back to the saying, ka ora te wai, ka ora te whenua, ka ora na tangata. If the water is healthy, the land is healthy, and the people are healthy. And ultimately what we at Water New Zealand and our water community are trying to do is to ensure that the public health is looked after, because we know if we get it wrong, people can get ill and potentially die. That we shouldn't just be thinking about drinking water, that we need to think about the impact of wastewater and stormwater on the environment's health, and that we have many passionate people who are working in the sector every day to keep you and me safe and to ensure that we can wake up in the morning and turn on a tap and have a good glass of water, and that that we are providing the facilities to, look after the wastewater, whether we flushed our toilets, used our washing machines, had a shower, etc.
That's a great, very beautiful description. Gillian, what would be your message to young water professionals or young professionals that might be listening to you right now?
I would say that the water sector is a fascinating community. It comes with fascinating challenges that if you're beginning to think about a career in water, there are many different options. I mean, I think about, my background with regulatory and strategy, there's a space. I mean, I'm not a water engineer. I did economics at university. There is a space for you. If you're somebody who is interested in marketing, interested in customer engagement, if you're somebody who's a process engineer, there is, or a scientist, there are so many different options that are available to you in the water sector that I would say, put your hand up and seize the opportunities. I would make the most of going to local regional events and finding out and talking to people and absorbing, being a sponge. Because I
Yes.
think there are some really great things to learn from your colleagues and from the collaboration with others.
That's right. And there's so many stuff coming up in New Zealand that is such an interesting area to be involved as well. And you sort of mentioned it there, but I'm curious, and that with this we'll wrap up, Gillian. Why do you work in the water sector?
My introduction to New Zealand, because I came from the UK originally, was around structural and regulatory reform of the electricity sector.
Yes.
And so when I saw the opportunity at Water New Zealand, being advertised, I saw the opportunity to bring the skills that I have developed over my career in terms of regulatory and strategy, and infrastructure is a fascinating place and water is fascinating. And so I find myself learning something new every day, occasionally things I don't want to know or I wish I didn't need to know. But I think to me, it's a fascinating space to be in. And I've met many passionate people.
It is. Yeah. That's very interesting because, yeah, it's true. Like sometimes we also need that people that have experience in a particular segment of the sector as you in the regulatory space and bring it here. And we're very lucky to have you in the sector here working for all of us and for people over there in New Zealand. Gillian, thank you very much for your time today. I think this was a fascinating conversation, where probably this is kind of the basics of the reform. And I know we could just keep talking about it, but it's just a brush of the initial stuff for people to understand what a country that is very close to us, what's happening. And they're going through many different, you certainly are going through many different processes. And I can't wait to see what happens after September this year and in the next few years, how things will evolve and how that it would have really good effects in the water sector in New Zealand. So thank you very much for joining us today and teach us all of this.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's it on for today on our Water Connection. Thank you for listening and being part of our community. Your voice matters to us, you know that. So please click on the link, send a message in the description below, and leave us something. What did you learn today from Gillian? If you have a question or you have any feedback or any ideas of topics that you would like us to look after, put in there and share them with all of us. We'll love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform and social media for any updates and highlights. We'll see you later and keep that curiosity flowing.